The United States gained its independence on July 4, 1776, but the Constitution, with its strong federal government, wasn't ratified until 1789. So, what was going on? The United States during this time period was a very different place. The 13 former colonies that made up the Union had their own distinct cultures and identities. Before and during the Revolution, they had found a common cause, but now they hardly saw themselves as one close nation. In fact, people didn't say the United States is, they said the United States are. Founding fathers such as George Washington, James Madison, and Benjamin Rush believed that an extensive postal system, one that would become the engine of communication, was the answer. The post office was founded in 1775, a full year before the United States was even a country. Benjamin Franklin was the first postmaster general. This postal service, though, was pretty terrible. In 1790, running on a limited budget, it had only 75 post offices and only consisted of 1,875 miles of post roads. Its customers were only limited to the merchants and businessmen who lived right along the coast. Newspapers weren't even official mail, and their distribution relied on private arrangements between postmasters and publishers. This uncertainty discouraged the quality publishing needed for democracy. Fees were high, theft was common, and service was inconsistent and slow. It took more than a month to send a letter from Maine to Georgia. Transforming the post into a system that will carry information to every individual in the nation was an ambitious and challenging task for the young government. Washington asked Congress multiple times to do something about the post, but legislators had good reasons to delay. The expansion Washington requested would require a post office, a part of the federal government, in every town in the Union. In a time where the government had few functions, this would drastically expand its reach, something that the states might not like. Also, the idea of the federal government's right to build post roads was particularly contentious. Therefore, legislators were very vague about what the federal government could do regarding the post. Eventually, after much heated debate, Congress delivered. On February 20, 1792, President George Washington signed the Post Office Act of 1792. Now, mail service wasn't just limited to a few, but it was rather authorized for everyone. Though the language used by legislators was very broad, the country's post network was starting to improve. In 1801, there were 903 post offices and more than 21,000 miles of post roads. An amazing part of the new and improved post was how Americans got an unprecedented amount of say in the network's design. This act encouraged the idea that if a group of people needed postal service, the federal government would provide it. This idea was instrumental in the country's expansion into the West. Pioneers were much more likely to migrate out west if they could expect a link to the country's communications engine, a link to the federal government, a place on the map. In this sense, post offices functioned as physical outposts of the federal government and were essential in the country's physical and political development. There was a petitioning process for getting your community access to mail service. This process was often very successful. Congress would then determine the route by which the mail would get there. Essentially, Congress and the federal government would directly respond to the will of the people. Just as planned, economic and civic development followed the mail. Clusters of log cabins in the wilderness, only accessible by trails through the forest, were being turned into named villages connected by roads. By 1809, the United States had almost 2,300 post offices and more than 36,000 miles of post routes. 20, and 30 times more respectively than in 1790. The expansion of the post office allowed for easier communication and was binding the vast nation together. Benjamin Rush, a leading founder, advocated for the idea that the post should deliver newspapers and be a tool to promote literacy among the people of the nation. This mindset was evident in the Post Office Act, as it treated newspapers for the first time as official mail. Newspapers were entitled to the same secure handling as letters. It also had a very low postage rate. This policy was very different from Britain and helped the struggling press grow. Encouraging the spread of information and literacy in this vast nation of wilderness is all well and good. But great things cost great money. There is plenty of debate on how the post was going to be funded. Some founders, such as Alexander Hamilton, believed that the postal system should remain concentrated on the East Coast, where it would be the most profitable. Other founders, such as Benjamin Rush and Washington, believed that newspapers should be shipped free even if it means that the service wasn't profitable. The end was a compromise, and the profitable routes from the more populous regions paid for the unprofitable rural regions. This law also guaranteed access to secure information and ideas. This law made it a crime for anyone to open the mail, except the one to whom it is addressed to. This law's stance regarding interference powerfully reinforces the people's First Amendment rights. So the post was binding together the people. But how was the mail actually being moved? The United States was big, and it was only growing. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the Republic's size doubled, and soon enough the United States stretched from sea to shining sea. Delivering mail to the remote parts of the country was extremely difficult. Since the Revolution, the horseback rider was the most common way of communicating, but with the demand for mail exploding, a new method of transportation was replacing these overflowing burdened horses: the stagecoach. The stagecoach was essentially a large, enclosed, horse-drawn vehicle, and it worked especially well on America's terrible roads and, unlike horses, offered good protection from the elements. Stagecoach lines started to connect the major cities. The post subsidized these lines to carry the mail. Coaches were slower and more expensive than horseback riders, but they could carry a lot more mail a lot more predictably. It dominated the East up until the mid-1800s and played an important role in the West for even longer. Land transportation was great. Water was and still is the best way to transport goods. The problem was that the currents and tides interfered with the reliability of mail delivery. All of this changed when Robert Fulton launched America's first commercial steamboat line in 1807. Now you could easily travel anywhere in any direction on any navigable waterway. Contracts were made with companies, and soon enough mail was being carried on waterways via steamboats. In fact, since land travel was so difficult, steamboats carried mail to California via Panama. Steamboats would carry mail from New York to Panama, then the mail crossed the country on canoes or pack animals. Finally, another ship would take the mail north to California. The railroad was the next big advance. Advancements in transportation kept coming, and the Postal Service was at the forefront. The Pony Express, airmail, the list goes on and on. The history of the post office is the history of the United States. The 1792 Post Office Act transformed the post into the communications engine that brought information to every individual in the nation. The act helped cement the federal government's power to establish mail routes. Newspapers were treated as official mail, all while the mail wasn't allowed to be opened. The Postal Service provided a direct link to government in time where the states dominated in power. It educated the population by providing access to information. The legacy of the act lives on today. Even today, the Postal Service reaches places that no for-profit company ever could. Even today, the Postal Service is the communications engine that unites the states, and it all started with the Post Office Act of 1792.